prehistory of Northern Europe. Going to try to keep it 1 hour long and cover the period from 6200 BC all the way, which features a couple cataclysmic events in Europe, all the way to about 1000 to 1100 AD with the end of the Viking Age and kind of the spread of Christianity into Scandinavia and the beginning of the historical period there. So first we should start off, Northern Europe. What is it? Northern Europe would be kind of the area from the Northern Urals across northern Russia, St. Petersburg, Arkhangelsk, that whole area, as well as Finland, Scandinavian states, Estonia, the Baltic states, kind of Poland, Germany, the Low Countries, northern France, Britain, and Ireland. Northern Europe today shares a broadly similar genetic profile wherever you go. There are some, the Sami and the Nemets peoples are kind of the odd ones out, but by and large, it's still very similar genetically the way it was, about 4,000 years ago, or I should say 3,000 years ago. That being said, it wasn't always the case. It used to be much more diverse, and rather than there being a kind of Northern European world, as there was in the time of the Viking Age, there are actually several different smaller worlds within it. The world has become a much smaller place. Things have become much more homogenized with improved transportation, gathering of energy, and just the passage of time itself. So let's go over some of those worlds that were there in the year 6200 BC. So 6200 BC, the map of Europe was very, very different. You had the Baltic in particular would have looked very strange. You had all sorts of frozen lakes and whatnot. Large parts of it were uninhabited by humans. You had the Scandinavian Hunter-Gatherers, the SHGs, who were kind of living in part of Scandinavia. To the southeast of them, you had the Eastern Hunter-Gatherers in northern Russia, reaching all the way down into eastern Ukraine and the Volga Basin. The Volga is the main river in Russia. It goes and connects to the Caspian Sea. To the west, in Germany, in the Baltic, as well as Doggerland, Britain and Ireland, you had the Western Hunter-Gatherers, who were a very distinctive people. They, were fairly tall. I think the average one was about, at least when they were well-fed, they would go and tower at about 175 centimeters in height, which was very, very tall for a prehistoric man. Then you had some other groups of hunter-gatherers in kind of southwestern France and in Iberia that were kind of unique, and they had all sorts of kind of poorly understood interactions with the Western hunter-gatherers. You also had in the Caucasus Mountains the Caucasian hunter-gatherers who go and play a role in this as well. And in the Neolithic, that's the period of agriculture, the most important group was the Anatolian farmers, or as they would soon be called after they entered Europe and mixed slightly with the local Western hunter-gatherers, they become known as the early European farmers, or EEFs. Early European farmers is kind of a mouthful, so I'll just call them the EEFs, but everyone else I will call them by their full hunter-gatherer title. So 6200 BC, another thing that was very distinctive about the map of Europe was that there was a place called Doggerland. That is, that Britain and Ireland were connected to each other, and they were also connected to the mainland of Europe. You could actually walk from the Netherlands to Britain. So as a result, or I think Ireland had actually split off like 1,000 or 2,000 years before that. So the Irish hunter-gatherers were all kind of isolated and strange. There were maybe like 3 to 10,000 of those Western hunter-gatherers living in Ireland at any given time. And they kind of went their own separate path of development and became distinctive from the other Western hunter-gatherers. In Britain, though, that wasn't the case. They just kind of got separated because the continental shelf off the coast of Norway actually went and collapsed and caused these massive tsunamis. It's believed there were about 3 of them. and they just drowned Doggerland in this massive tide of water. So presumably everyone who was there died, and it was horrible for them. At the same time, unknown if it's related, but roughly around that same period, the 63rd century BC, you also have these major floods in the Danube River. The Danube River is a river that feeds into the Black Sea and goes all the way, through Romania, through Hungary, Austria, all of that. So kind of, the border between the Balkans and the rest of Europe. So those floods, what they do, those devastate the Western hunter-gatherer populations in the Danube basin, and they kind of open up Europe for the expansion of the EEFs. The EEFs, some of them had settled in Greece and in Crete as early as 7000 BC, but they'd kind of been hemmed in by the Western hunter-gatherers up until those catastrophes of the 63rd century. So with their kind of, in some ways, they were inferior to the Western hunter-gatherers. In some ways, they were superior. They were inferior in the sense that they were shorter, they were weaker, they were more disease-prone, and that was because agriculture. They were an agricultural people. They would farm, whereas the Western hunter-gatherers were focused more on fishing, on hunting, gathering, that kind of thing. The more you need meat, it's very important. So the early European farmers, the EEFs, they go and they just kind of explode across Europe, starting in 6200 BC after the Western hunter-gatherers were devastated by those cataclysmic weather events. The other thing that might have given an advantage to the EEFs was that they carried things like pigs with them. And one of the things we know from the Amerindians is that pigs were absolutely devastating to Amerindian populations once De Soto kind of introduced them to the Americas. Pigs are relatively similar to humans by animal standards. They carry all sorts of diseases that humans can carry too. It's one of the reasons you're supposed to really cook your pork before you eat it. So when the pigs go wild, they go and mess with everything. They can devour all sorts of other food sources and spread diseases that can be devastating to populations. Personally, my guess is we don't have any direct evidence of that, but my suspicion is that kind of the introduction of those pigs that the EEFs had adaptations for living with them for hundreds of years, whereas the Western hunter-gatherers did not, really kind of aided their spread into Europe. Now, the spread of the EEFs into Europe was limited in a lot of ways. There had already been several thousand years of kind of agricultural into Europe. That being said, their crops were not nearly as good as the ones of the classical or Middle Ages. They had a much more limited ecological range, and specifically, they focused on colonizing what are called low S soils. So the areas that they did settle were very limited, and there were large parts of Europe that they would just kind of bypass. And those areas were still populated by the Western hunter-gatherers, or, in some places, by the other various weird hunter-gatherer groups. The other issue, too, was that their crops were poorly adapted for the cold. There were some things like winter-resistant rye, for instance, was not invented until the Middle Ages. So, large parts of Europe, Ukraine, the Baltic, Belarus could just not be settled by agricultural peoples at any point in prehistory. It wasn't until the historical period that agriculture was really able to, spread to those regions. And that's when you have kind of the rise of the Russians and, the demographic explosion of the Slavic peoples. Whereas previously they'd been just kind of swamp men hiding out in the swamps of Belarus. So you have this kind of expansion of the early European farmers. It takes them about 800 years to reach their ecological limits. They go all the way to Portugal in the west. They reach France in the northwest. However, like the northern coast remains the domain of the Western hunter-gatherers. like Berlin, for instance, is known even today for its kind of sandy soils and it's poor for agriculture. And that was one of the reasons the Prussians and, Brandenburg and Prussia, they focused heavily on manufacturing to make up for their weakness in agriculture back in the 17th century. That's always been an issue. And, back in the Neolithic period, that's when the early European farmers, the EEFs, were spreading farming around Europe. They just could not penetrate that region. The Western hunter-gatherers dominated it, as well as kind of this broad arc all the way from what's nowadays Estonia and the Baltic states through northern Poland, even kind of into central Poland, kind of northern and central Germany. The Low Countries were dominated by the Western hunter-gatherers, as well as kind of northern France. So 800 years, EEFs, they kind of colonize everything they can, and they start to expand outward. Their population kind of grows consistently until roughly 4800 BC, and that's when they kind of reach the limits of their internal growth. The EEFs, from everything we knew about them, were an intensely xenophobic culture. They would go and, at least at this specific period, I should say, that changes later. Very intensely kind of xenophobic, isolationist. There's all sorts of signs that they acted similarly to kind of some of the more irritable American colonists, I should say, where they'd have a dispute with each other, and then just kind of everyone who sided with one side of that dispute would just kind of split off and leave and join their own new town or agricultural village somewhere. They were an extremely violent society, and it would become even worse later on. There's some signs that one particular group got chased all the way from what's modern day Croatia all the way to what's nowadays Valencia in Spain, before their enemies finally caught up with them a couple hundred years later and finished them off. So definitely not a very kind or tolerant society, and they extended that to the Western hunter-gatherers as well. There was some mixing with the Western hunter-gatherers fairly early on when they were in the Balkans, and for the early European farmers, the EEFs that were in Northern Europe, they didn't really mix with them after that until the cataclysm of the 45th century, which we'll get to shortly. So, 4800, they've kind of reached the, you start to see what looks like might be kind of chiefdoms. There's an increase in political centralization in the very beginning, or I should say the end of the 6th millennium BC, beginning of the 5th millennium BC. And this kind of political centralization, and really political centralization across the Neolithic, it seems, was, again, not a very pleasant process. There's actually such extensive issues with kind of farming and starvation that the EEFs were steadily evolving to be, shorter people. We still kind of see that legacy today, where peoples in Southern Europe who have more of this early European farmer ancestry are shorter than the peoples of Northern Europe who have, less of this early European farmer ancestry for reasons that we will get into shortly. So 4800 BC, we start to see, there's been some kind of chiefdoms, microstates. They do have trade with each other at that point. There's evidence in France, for instance, that, the people of the Paris Valley were trading with people all the way in kind of northwestern France in the place called Brittany. The people in kind of the lower Rhine were trading with the people on the Elbe. So there's still sort of, you do see kind of the increase in social and economic complexity there. And at the same time, their languages would have been, in a lot of cases, mutually intelligible. You have this demographic explosion, that starts 6200 BC, and we're talking, 4800 BC, so it's only been 1400 years since all these different groups split off from each other. So it's pretty similar to how the Latin languages today are related to each other. The French, the Italians, the Spanish, a speaker of one of those languages can actually understand quite a bit of what another speaker of those languages is saying. And it makes it much, much easier to learn those languages as a result. I mean, even as an English speaker, you can understand a lot of like what a Spanish speaker or a French speaker is saying without that much training, just because so many of the words come from Latin. What language the early European farmers spoke is unknown. The kind of last surviving pure quote group of early European farmers is the Sardinians, who are still around today. And there are some historical references to them as the Nuragic civilization. They were also one of the peoples who contributed soldiers and sailors to the Sea Peoples expansion during that kind of first Greek wave of expansion and conquest in the Eastern Mediterranean. That being said, we don't really know that much about them. So, we're kind of reliant on some, etymologies from local place names, that kind of thing, to guess their language. And it's difficult to say what they spoke. There is one theory. There's a German linguist, Theo Veneman. He's very controversial. He has a theory called Atlanto-Semitic. And his belief is that a Semitic people, he believes it was the Carthaginians, was kind of settling around kind of Western and Northern Europe, and massively influenced the Celtic languages in particular, and left a lot of place names. How true this is, I'm skeptical, so are a lot of other linguists. That being said, I think it's an interesting theory because some of the points he makes, like the names for the Thames, for instance, there's a river, it starts with a T in Iberia too, and I guess there's just a bunch of hydronyms, words for water, in a lot of parts of Western Europe that do like kind of start with a T and have these similarities. And the argument is that these there's this old European hydronymy. There's all these words for these waterways and water sources that are clearly non-Indo-European, and there's something else. If his theory, I don't think his theory for Atlanto-Semitic is necessarily true, but I do think there is an argument to be made that the early European farmers spoke a very early version of what's nowadays Berber, which kind of sounds strange because the Berbers, they live in northern and kind of the northern Africa and the Sahara. But there's actually a migration of the early European farmers between 4400 BC and 3800 BC. We know this because of some events that I'll talk about shortly, where they replaced about half the population of northern Africa in that 600-year range. And by North Africa, I mean specifically Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria. And even today, the peoples of kind of northwestern Africa, they share, about 40 to 50% of their ancestry is from that early European farmer group that migrated from Iberia into North Africa. Unfortunately, there's a lot of issues with lack of archaeological studies, lack of ancient DNA. I think we only have like 6 ancient DNA samples from North Africa, which is not much to work with. Ideally, we'd have hundreds. But it does look like there was something that went on there. Notably, there's a haplogroup lineage called R1b V88. So R1b, it's very common in Western Europe, but the V88 lineage is not common at all in Western Europe. And it's most commonly found in the island of Sardinia, which of course is the place that has the most, they're like 80% EEF in ancestry. And, the other places you find R1b V88 are the Baggara Arabs of Sudan. They're this very dark-skinned group in Sudan that has a lot of Middle Eastern and, some EEF ancestry. And also the Hausa people of northern Nigeria, something of whom like 60 or 80% of them, I can't remember, they are R1b V88 in ancestry. So my personal suspicion is there's this migration between 4400 BC and 3800 BC of this early European farmer group, went in North Africa, across the Green Sahara, ended up kind of being the ruling clan, for whatever reason, of this group of Chadic-speaking. Chadics are the ancestors of the Hausa, as well as a number of the other peoples of Chad, the country. And just kind of spread their Y chromosome everywhere. Anyhow, very theoretical, but I think there is a very, since they spread that Y chromosome, that far, and it's associated with the spread of these Afro-Asiatic languages, Berber, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, those are all Afro-Asiatic languages. I do think it's very possible that the EEFs, they spoke specifically Proto-Berber, or I should say pre-Proto-Berber, because Proto-Berber was only spoken in Roman times. That's a whole nother story. I'll have to do a space on North Africa at some point. It's all very fascinating. So going back to Northern Europe, so we see, don't really know what language they speak, and they have the Western hunter-gatherers that are kind of living at the fringes of their society. So with these kind of state consolidations in the late 6th, early 5th millennium BC, you start to see a lot of other problems. Like I mentioned earlier, people are getting shorter, very unhealthy. And in 2 specific sites, one of them is called Herxheim, one of them is in Talheim. Both of them, as you can guess from the names, are in what's nowadays Germany. There's actually mass human sacrifice. Not like, just ordinary human sacrifice where, people, they, sacrifice, like the Indo-Europeans, for instance, would sacrifice, like their brides and retainers with, when a warlord died, that kind of thing. Gave them a reason to make sure that their lord lived as long as he possibly could. This appears to be specifically more of like an Aztec type human sacrifice, where they demand, related to warfare with the kind of EEFs of what's nowadays Czechia, Bohemia, Moravia, that kind of area, as well as the Western hunter-gatherer chiefdoms in the Low Countries. It looks like they would kind of, if they had battle captives, they would just brutally sacrifice and cannibalize them. Maybe it was local villages that rebelled. But it's definitely on a scale that's not seen anywhere outside of kind of the Aztec realm of the 15th century. So, kind of the beginning of the 5th millennium BC in northwestern Europe was a very, very grim place. At the same time, you have the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers. That's the group we mentioned earlier that's in Scandinavia. As Scandinavia is kind of warming up, they are adopting new techniques. They're fishing, hunting all sorts of coastal animals, and they're forming the pitted ware culture. And that's kind of the Scandinavian group that's hanging out in Sweden. And they reach all the way down into Scania, which is the southern part of Sweden. But they don't penetrate into Denmark, which is still kind of Western hunter-gatherer territory held by the Ertubola culture, which, reaches into, northern Germany and the Netherlands. So the first kind of great victory for the Western hunter-gatherers is actually in what's nowadays northern Poland. The Western hunter-gatherers there, they actually overrun the early European farmers, and they create the first of several synthetic cultures. And it's kind of interesting, of course, Poland is, fairly cold. It's not as nice as even Germany is, and definitely not France. So it's most likely due to kind of the weaknesses of the EEFs in Poland, and that's why they're the first to fall to the what's called the hunter-gatherer resurgence. And that would have been about 300 to 400 years before the rest of Europe falls to these resurgent Western hunter-gatherers who, were making their comeback after 14 to 1800 years of, being relegated to the hinterlands. So the 49th century, that kind of passes whatever was going on with their, mass human sacrifice in Western Germany and Eastern France. And, you have kind of the stasis across Europe. The only place that actually does well is that kind of synthetic culture, where the Western hunter-gatherers took over that early European farmer society in Poland. These societies, due to their extreme xenophobia, like, in the Americas, for instance, which are kind of the best documented examples we have of hunter-gatherer and Neolithic, that's like Stone Age, but farming societies. A lot of them would just call themselves the people, and everyone else, all of their neighbors that they knew, they would just call something like the enemies, the savages, the demons, or whatever. So, in Europe, Asia, Africa, very, very similar story. People are pretty similar everywhere. So the synthetic culture, once the Western hunter-gatherers, they took over the EEF society in Poland, they kind of they exchanged their technologies, which definitely made it better for the people who survived that horrible, horrible war. And it was pretty horrible, especially if you're an EF man, because you got killed. A lot of the women survived. I think that specific culture in Poland, actually had some of the highest amount of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. It was like 50% Western hunter-gatherer and 50% early European farmer. The other ones that would happen later would have a lot less. But, the pattern was similar, where you'd have kind of the Western hunter-gatherers would take over, set themselves up as the lords on top of these settled EEF societies. They would exchange technologies and kind of advance forward as a synthetic culture. So a couple hundred years go by, 400 years specifically, you have this kind of stagnation or decline across Northern Europe for these EEF societies. And for whatever reason, in the 45th century BC, all of the EEF societies everywhere collapsed, with the sole exception of Croatia for unknown reasons. In Iberia and Germany and France and Hungary, you see the these kind of Western hunter-gatherers. They rise out of the hinterlands, and they kind of overthrow these decadent and stagnant EEF chiefdoms or statelets. So horrible period. There's tons of population decline. And some of these kind of synthetic cultures actually end up doing fairly well after that period of decline and conflict ends. You had, before this whole thing, there were whole zones of depopulation, part of Belgium and northwestern Germany. You had this 25 to 30 kilometer wide no man's zone where no one lived. And it was the border region between the EEF societies and the Western hunter-gatherer societies. So with the triumph of the EEFs in the 45th century, with the triumph of the Western hunter-gatherers in the 45th century over the early European farmers, that kind of ends, and you have these synthetic cultures, which I'm still going to call EEFs for convenience sake, since they were early, they were European, and they were farmers. So you have kind of these mixed cultures spread. Why did the Western hunter-gatherers take over the early European farmers? It's very much an open question. There's actually copper smelting had been invented, I believe, in the 46th century. And another pattern that kind of appears all over the world is that metalworking, metal mining, all that kind of stuff was actually not, it's not something that the civilized peoples did. It was something that the kind of marginal peoples in the remote areas did. For instance, some of the greatest metal workers in the Middle Bronze Age weren't the great cities of, the Indus River Valley. It wasn't the peoples of Mesopotamia or the Indo-Europeans, the Egyptians. It was actually a people living in the Altai Mountains, which is in the middle of nowhere even today, who are called now as the Saima-Turbino people. And my personal suspicion is that what happened is that with the adoption of copper spreading, you see this sudden shift in the balance of power, where you have these Western hunter-gatherer societies that have access to metals now. They're more dominant in trade routes. And, as opposed to a few hundred years before, when the EEF societies had been extremely xenophobic and rejected everyone, kind of the experience under these consolidated, relatively more bureaucratic states enabled them to interact more with the early European farmers, learn their language, learn their weaknesses, form various alliances, and eventually take over. So that's, kind of a European wide story. So with these new synthetic cultures, they kind of experience a couple centuries of decline, most likely due to the result of apocalyptic warfare. It's these synthetic states warring against the remnants of the EEF chiefdoms. But by kind of 4100, 4200 BC, that largely ends. The independent EEF states are largely defeated, and the synthetic cultures have emerged triumphant. And the new synthetic cultures, they adopt, they have the mixture, one, of the original EEF technology, with farming in the lowest soils. Two, they have the fishing, the exploitation of cultural resources of the Western hunter-gatherer societies. And three, they actually go and figure out how to exploit the more sandy soils of kind of the North Sea and Baltic Sea coast. And that's something seen not just with the Polish synthetic cultures, but also the ones in Germany and France as well. These societies definitely form considerably larger states than the previous period of EEF consolidation at the beginning of the 5th millennium BC. There's, I mentioned earlier there was somewhat of a unique Western hunter-gatherer group that was living in Iberia and southern Spain. We actually see, as you have this kind of reformation of states in this Western hunter-gatherer EEF synthetic period towards the end of the 5th millennium, beginning of the 4th millennium BC, you actually see that kind of unique hunter-gatherer ancestry being spread all the way to northern France and the Paris Basin, as well as kind of the more distinctive types of the Western hunter-gatherers found in northern Europe being spread all the way down to the Pyrenees. So there's some kind of, French state, and it wasn't really French in the sense that, they didn't speak French. They don't even contribute that much ancestry to the modern French, but they were in France. And you also go and you see interesting things like organized colonization programs within Germany. The Mitchellsburg culture, which kind of originates from kind of north eastern France, the kind of Belgium, the Rhine area, roughly. They go and they're actually building these kind of fortified settlements as they're expanding from west to east. Very similar to what the Franks would do and the Germans during their march to the east in the Middle Ages. Very, very similar stuff. So they're kind of building these fortified settlements, particularly on strategic positions, river crossings, that kind of thing. Protecting their animals, granaries most likely, that kind of stuff. So the other thing we go and we see during this period of consolidation after the kind of chaotic overthrow of the original EEF realms is the spread of megalith building. Megaliths actually started right around the time of the hunter-gatherer resurgence in the 45th century BC. Specifically in Brittany, in northwestern France. And what we see is that it spreads via sea routes. So it goes all the way around to kind of western Iberia, spreads around the French coast, and all the way into Scandinavia during the expansion of the funnel beaker culture, which I'll get to later. But first, kind of Britain. So around 4000, maybe 4100 BC, the kind of realm or ecumen, whatever you want to call it, it's uncertain how centralized it was, goes and starts to expand from France into the previously Western hunter-gatherer inhabited only, British Isles. So they kind of move in there, and they're settling groups of thousands of them within there. And they appear to be, at least in part, organized by this blood priesthood. The burials we see at the megalith sites, which were undoubtedly some kind of holy ritual site related to religion, they'd erect these giant stone structures that people presumably worshipped at. Stonehenge is a much later, though a very famous example, even though that was like 1,500 years after the period we're talking about. Interestingly, they're organized by male lineages. We can tell from their Y chromosomal haplogroup, which is passed down undivided father to son. These guys were all cousins in the male line. The way that they organized their architecture, too, was they would build longhouses similar to, what the Iroquois had in kind of our own Northeast. So, presumably there were warrior lodges organized by clans, that kind of thing. And they had this blood priesthood. At the same time, going a bit further east, we have in the Baltic the Western hunter-gatherers in that same period of, the 45th century, 4400 BC. Interestingly, there's no Western hunter-gatherer resurgence, since there's nothing for the Western hunter-gatherers to resurge against. The people there, were untouched by the EEFs. They couldn't penetrate into northern Poland or Belarus, much less the Baltic. But instead, you have this migration of the Eastern hunter-gatherers, these people from northern Russia and the Volga Basin, who actually go and they replace maybe 40 to 50% of the population within the Baltic. There's definitely a lot of heterogeneity within the Baltic and Estonia. So it looks like there was kind of a mess of these racially distinctive and undoubtedly linguistically and culturally distinctive peoples in the Baltic as well. So it would have been a mess there. Another thing that's interesting, the Western, I talked earlier about how the early European farmers, they would have spoken very similar languages to each other just due to it only been 1,800 to 2,000 years of separation. Well, the Western hunter-gatherers were much, much more diverse than the early European farmers. And when they're setting themselves up as the new rulers of these early European farmer states, they're most likely spreading their languages as well. So they're kind of ending whatever there might have been of this ecumene or kind of EEF world that reigned throughout most of Europe, and they're fragmenting it in a lot of ways. So now we're in the beginning of the 4th millennium BC. Things are actually going well for the new, synthetic WHG EEF societies. They go and they have this kind of sustained population boom. Britain and Ireland are being colonized. There's expansions into Poland, northern Germany, and into Scandinavia as well. The Ertabola culture is kind of overrun. That's the Western hunter-gatherers, in Denmark, by the synthetic cultures. And Scania, that's the southern part of Sweden, gets colonized by the funnel-beaker culture. The funnel-beaker culture is most likely the descendants of that very early synthetic culture that we discussed earlier in kind of northern and central Poland, which was kind of the first EEF group that got taken over by the Western hunter-gatherers in any part of Europe. So they go and they have an expansion too. And during that expansion, they actually do get linked in with the kind of the megalith building cultures, even though they're pretty distinctive, most likely spoke a different language, would have looked different, and had a very different ancestral composition. So they go ahead, most likely via the sea trade, they go and they adopt megalith building. We don't know about the blood priesthood. We only have evidence for Brittany and Britain, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was something similar elsewhere too. In that period, we see, there's an amber trade where stuff from the Baltic and Prussia, northeastern Germany, kind of gets traded around northern Europe, exported all the way down south to the Mediterranean. Some of it, later on, would eventually reach Egypt. At the same time, I've kind of neglected the circumpolar world. So the very far north, like what's modern-day Lapland, Sapmi, the very far northern part of Scandinavia, Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, all of those areas of the far north, they were very much part of their own separate world. Their lifestyles were very different. They relied on kind of the Arctic ecologies to live off of. And, they actually were expanding into the Ob-Irtish Basin in Western Siberia, or at the very least, they traded with them, as early as, 4,000, 4,500 BC. They had some of their more southerly branches actually had they built orchards, they'd kind of grow trees and, harvest nuts and that kind of thing, so that they could have a reliable food supply in addition to their hunting and gathering. So they weren't totally primitive by any means. They definitely had long-distance trade. There's some suggestions they might have had interactions as far east as Korea, or have been influenced by the Koreans themselves. It's difficult to say. Definitely a lot more research needs to be done. And we'll get to, we'll discuss them more later on. It looks like the border was kind of like modern day southwestern Finland would have been ruled by Western hunter-gatherers and linked in with the Baltic peoples there, whereas, kind of northern Finland, Karelia maybe, and then the far north of Scandinavia would have been inhabited more by those Scandinavian hunter-gatherers that we talked about earlier that were part of the pitted ware culture. So 3600 BC, that's kind of the beginning of the end of the synthetic, EEF and WHG, Western Hunter-Gatherer societies. There's a big change in climate right around the end of the 37th century, and you see populations really start to stagnate. The weather gets a lot worse after 3400 BC, and that's when you really start to see widespread population collapse across Northern Europe. The exception to that is the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers that we mentioned earlier, the pitted ware culture. They actually go and they overrun the funnel beaker EEFs in kind of southern Scandinavia and in Denmark. And they're, starting to expand further and further south into Denmark, and on to Gotland. They had kind of like a Cold War, or probably a hot war, honestly, going on with the funnel beaker EEFs in Gotland. That's that island in the Black Sea between Sweden and the Baltic states. So very, very, very interesting stuff going on. You have in a lot of places, what happens is people are switching from kind of a more heavy grain-based lifestyle to a much more pastoral economy. They, want things they can move around in case of raiders. There is evidence in that period that the Orkney Islands specifically were the center of some sort of like EEF pirate state that was, kind of raiding and preying on quite a bit of Northern Europe, actually. Definitely Britain for sure. Around 3200 BC, there's evidence of political consolidation in Ireland and Britain, whether it was in opposition to these Orkney Island pirates. And the Orkney Islands, they're these islands to the north of Scotland in a very kind of cold, foreboding place. You've got that kind of going on. But it's kind of a brief-lived revival. You have these constructions of these large passage tombs. And, interestingly, it's unknown if the religion was evolving at that point, if there was some sort of new royal ideology. But they actually practiced royal incest, where one of the burials, most likely the ruler of a good chunk of Ireland and possibly Britain as well, was actually the product of first-degree incest, whether it was brother-sister or, parent-child, is uncertain. But very kind of similar to what the Egyptians had and what the Persians had at various points in their history, where they kind of considered themselves to be divine beings, god kings, reigning over a mass of undifferentiated inferiors. So a lot of stuff going on in the 33rd century. Despite the obvious war, incest is terrible. There was it was a revival. There was a increase in the population in the period. You do see, more economic complexity. There was more stability. So life for the average person probably did improve in that period, just because they weren't being, raided and enslaved and whatever. So, it was kind of a Indian summer, though they were not going to last long. So far, far to the east, you have this group of people, the Indo-Europeans, the Yamnaya culture, whatever you want to call them. And, around 3300 BC, they had learned to, kind of use milk a lot better than other people could. They developed this more pastoral economy and, became gradually more and more sophisticated. They had horses, they had carts, and then finally around 3000 BC, they came across this giant copper mine, which they immediately massively exploited, and most likely it gave them this tremendous military advantage. So in this kind of a brief period of conquest and destruction, they go and they conquer everything from the Volga to the Rhine, between 3000 and 2800 BC. Incredibly destructive people. Whatever had been left of agriculture in that kind of 6th century long period of decline from 3600 BC to 3000 BC, they largely just finished off. And however many, it's very difficult from, radiocarbon dating and, soil layers and all that kind of thing to get a precise dates. But that 2-century period, it could have been all done under one single kind of Indo-European Genghis Khan kind of figure. So very, very much not pleasant for the early European farmers. There was interaction there wasn't just, total annihilation between the early European farmers and the Indo-Europeans. The globular amphora culture, which had serious issues with the funnel beakers, they didn't really mix in with each other in Eastern Europe at all. Clearly very, very fierce enemies. It looks like at least some of them allied with and were integrated into Indo-European society. So the Indo-Europeans, in kind of the early and mid 3rd millennium BC, they actually go and have a lot of this ancestry from that synthetic Western hunter-gatherer, early European farmer, synthetic culture, specifically through that globular amphora culture in kind of Eastern Germany and Poland and Czechia and stuff. Some of those groups or some of the male line descendants of the, those globular amphora people would end up rising very, very high in Indo-European society, specifically in Scandinavia. They were, the Indo-Europeans were largely haplogroups R1A and R1B, with R1A being kind of the royal lineage, it looks like. Haplogroup I, which was held by, the globular amphora people, they had gotten it, of course, from the Western hunter-gatherers who installed themselves as the leaders, over 1,000 years before when they took over the early European farmer cultures in the 45th century BC collapse. So they get allied with the Indo-Europeans, end up being integrated, and in Scandinavia, their male line descendants at least become the rulers and of that society. There's actually some linguistic evidence of that too. A lot of words, like for Rex, Roy, Regent, Realm, Reich, Raj, Raja, those all kind of relate to, like sovereignty, rule, that kind of thing. And the words in English aren't necessarily the same. We have a word like king, for instance, that clearly isn't related. Other words, like the English is a Germanic language, by the way, a word for boat, a lot of words for seafaring. Those might not be from the Indo-European languages, but rather this globular amphora EEF language. So a lot of stuff related to seafaring and rulership could be our linguistic legacy from our globular amphora ancestors. So a couple hundred years go by, the Indo-Europeans, they're like the Comanche, kind of roving around, burning down forests to make pasture lands for their animals, that kind of thing. And you can't exist in stasis forever. They come in contact with this bell beaker culture, which starts off in Iberia, which is modern-day Spain and Portugal. And the bell beakers, it started off as kind of a seafaring culture in the Mediterranean, as well as Western Europe. Looks like they kind of followed the old sea routes of the amber traders in the megalithic period. And, it's very possible that the contacts were directly through the, resurrected megalith worships. The Indo-Europeans, one of the things they did was they actually started building new megaliths as well as reusing old megaliths. They would, reinter certain people, possibly high-ranking people in their society, within these megaliths. So clearly they valued them quite a bit. Like Stonehenge, for instance, even though it got its start under the early European farmers, like two of the expansions were actually done by the Indo-Europeans after they conquered Britain. So the Indo-Europeans, anyhow, so they come in contact with these bell beaker people and are most likely attracted by the wealth that the Mediterranean and the rest of kind of the surviving EF states offer. So they go and they invent these fairly sophisticated boats, actually, for people that have been steppe herders. They take on a seafaring pretty quickly and immediately start kind of raiding all over. There's signs as early as 2550 BC in southwestern France that the Indo-European seafarers were already like raiding into the Bay of Biscay. So they very much that was kind of the second Viking age in a way. You had these, and the seafarers, by the way, were specifically from Denmark and Denmark, Sweden, and kind of northern Germany. So very much kind of the Viking area. There are probably ecological reasons for it. I mean, it's just a poor area. When all you have is intercepting amber from Prussia and the Baltic, there's not much of a reason to not go raiding far abroad for plunder. So anyhow, they start the second Viking age. The first Viking age was those Orkney Island pirates I talked about, and launched kind of this new seafaring invasion of Western Europe. There were land invasions too that affect the Mediterranean. I'll have to go over those in I'll do a Mediterranean world space at some point. We're mostly focused on the seafaring ones. The Indo-Europeans, pretty early on, they'd been divided into several lineages. Even in that very first period of land conquest, you had kind of like the group that was like northern Poland, the Baltic, Scandinavia, and you had another group that expanded into kind of Czechia, southern Germany, that area. It's difficult to say just from the information we have, like how close they were, what kind of conflicts they had with each other. But they definitely kind of left different legacies. We can tell from the Y chromosomal lineages. It was the northern group specifically that was doing kind of these seafaring conquests in northern Europe. And it was the southern group that went on and, conquered like Italy and the Balkans and stuff. Who France conquered, I'm not sure. Or who conquered France, I'm not sure. I'd have to look back at it. The seafaring Indo-Europeans from Scandinavia definitely at least hit some of the, ports and natural harbors and whatnot. So you have that second kind of wave of Indo-European conquests. They largely exterminate the population of the British Isles, place about half the population of France, about 40% of the population of Italy, and that's all done between, about 2400 and 2200 BC. The group that invades Iberia, goes and invades Sicily too, as well as the, like Majorca, the Balearic Islands. That's kind of outside of the scope of this space. So also around 2200 BC, there's this, there's all this weather events going on, all sorts of cataclysms. The Great Flood in the Bible possibly occurs around that time in the Middle East. You have Egypt's Old Kingdom collapses. There's stuff going on in China where they're like Yangtze, Austronesian civilizations like collapsed. There's stuff going on in southern India where, invaders from the north were more pastoral, and kind of herd cattle. They, go and overrun whoever was there before them. So a lot of stuff going on. And the far north was no exception to that. You have these people who speak the Orlic languages, like modern-day Estonian, Finnish, Nemets, that kind of thing. And they actually go and they have more sophisticated metalworking than the other peoples. Um, but at that point, you have specifically the ancestors of the Sami or the Lap people who go and they expand from kind of the northern part of the Urals all the way into northern Scandinavia and like the Kola Peninsula to the east of Murmansk, Russia. There's some other movements, like they get pushed out basically the Mezin River in modern day Arhangelsk Oblast in Russia. It's kind of the eastern border of the realm. They don't really penetrate that far to the south at that point, but that's the kind of first main Orlic migration west. And they would be followed 1,000 years later by other Orlics. So I was talking earlier, we have kind of the two known Indo-European clans, lineages, groups, whatever you want to call them. One was kind of more northernly, one was more southerly. The northern group, they have the incorporation of the globular amphoras, who eventually become the ruling class, and that's the ancestors of the modern-day Germanic peoples. Like English is a Germanic language, German, Gothic, Swedish, Icelandic, all those languages. And it's my personal belief that the survival of, or at least the very least rise of that globular amphora lineage played a part in why we have some unique rulership and seafaring words within the Germanic languages like English. Meanwhile, the southern groups, they became the ancestors like the Celts, the Italians, and the groups that the Greeks left the steppe a lot later. They didn't leave until like 2200 BC. They lived in Ukraine before that, as did the Armenians, but that's a whole nother story. So that's kind of the split, probably very, very early on, maybe about 3000 to 2600 BC. That's when we see the split between the Germans to the north and the Italians and the Celts to the south. So the Italians and the Celts, most likely they were living in southern Germany and Czechia at that time. Czechia itself was very unpopulated during the Bronze Age. It was very much kind of like a war zone between the Indo-Europeans and the, more southerly, the surviving kind of synthetic Western hunter-gatherer and EEF societies. So definitely not a fun place to be. But kind of those depopulated frontiers, that's something we see throughout history. Like today we have, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. You have, all sorts of stuff like that. So artificial political borders can very much become ecological ones as well. So going on, so in the first millennium, you have a couple more expansions. The Indo-Europeans have kind of maxed out their conquests in a lot of places, but you actually see at least two more invasions from Germany and kind of Bohemia, Austria area into Italy. So, the peoples of Italy keep on getting more and more of that original steppe Indo-European ancestry that's, gradually pouring in over the course of the second millennium. Why that was, no one's really sure, but, the Celts and the Italians were clearly, I guess Germany's just cold and Italy's nice and warm, has better soils in a lot of ways, so that probably played a pretty big role. Meanwhile, in the Baltic, you have the ancestors of the Slavic peoples was the Baltic people. Baltic peoples are the Lithuanians, the Latvians, Slavs like the Poles, the Russians, the Serbs, the Bulgarians. They're still united at that point. They're living in the swamps of Belarus and the Baltic, kind of a marginal area. Then they would not split until the Bronze Age collapse, which is another one of those great cataclysms. We talked about 6200 BC. That was a major cataclysm with the drowning of Doggerland, the Danube floods that paves the way open for the early European farmers, the EEFs, to sweep through Europe. We have the 45th century BC crisis where the Western hunter-gatherers rise up and overthrow the EEF civilization and create these synthetic cultures. At the same time, you have the Eastern hunter-gatherers sweep in and replace half the population of the Baltic. We have the 3600 BC crisis where the synthetic WHG and early European farmer cultures, have this crisis, and they start their centuries-long decline before the 3000 BC, the 31st century apocalypse, where the Indo-Europeans kind of go on and finish off a lot of their decadent civilization. 2200 BC, we have the kind of global crisis where, we see the arrival of the first Orlic-speaking peoples to, northern Scandinavia, the Kola Peninsula, as well as the invasions of the Greeks into Greece. And, now we have 1200 BC, the Bronze Age collapse, another one of those pivotal moments in history. The Bronze Age, people have been getting more and more sophisticated at metalworking, long-distance cultural contacts, and seafaring, all sorts of things. In that previous 2,000 years, since the start of the Bronze Age, there were trade routes that linked Scandinavia all the way to Egypt and into sub-Saharan Africa. You have, southern India is linked all the way in with the Levant. So there's very, very long-distance trade routes. You have international intrigues. The peoples of Mesopotamia are in contact with peoples from the Ural Mountains, like modern-day Chelyabinsk, Yekaterinburg area. So it's very much more of a sophisticated society, even if we don't have a lot of records for it. There were definitely states and contacts, diplomatic interactions and all sorts of other things, that could enable all sorts of interesting things to go along. So the Bronze Age collapse, you see all sorts of stuff. I mentioned earlier you had that kind of northern branch of the Indo-Europeans as they had gone and swept into Britain. And they actually left it as Britain as having one of the highest amounts of Indo-European ancestry anywhere in the world, since they wiped out about 90% of the population of the British Isles. Well, you have, in the Bronze Age collapse, 1200 BC, most likely due to the result of climate change, stuff gets drier, people are starving, they have to go and conquer territory to get food. It's even happened in the historical period, like with the Manchu invasion of China in 1644, for instance. Very cold period, Manchus were running out of food. They're like, well, what are we going to do? They invaded China, established the Qing dynasty that ruled all the way until 1911. This kind of stuff was very similar. You had the Celts in continental Europe who were probably running out of food. So they're just like, well, we should go to Britain. So they invade Britain. They replace about 40 to 50% of the population, pretty substantial. But some areas like the Orkney Islands actually remained outside of their dominion. We mentioned earlier the kind of Orkney Island pirates all the way back in 3200, 3400 BC. They were still around in a sense. They were never really conquered by the Indo-Europeans in the sense that their male lineages remain those same Western hunter-gatherer lineages from when they had installed themselves as the rulers of the EEFs in France back in the 45th century BC. They had gone and settled the British Isles, and even though the rest of the people in the British Isles were annihilated by the apocalyptic Indo-European invasion, the early European farmers of the Orkney Islands, even though they eventually became mostly Indo-European in ancestry due to extensive intermarriage, their Y chromosomal haplogroups remain the same. They're still haplogroup I. They don't shift over to R1A and R1B. So that could mean, it definitely means extensive mixing with the Indo-Europeans, whether or not it was them continuing in their pirate ways and, kidnapping Indo-European women, and adopting them into their culture as well as their children and gradually becoming more Indo-European that way. Or if it was more diplomatic and they just kind of got integrated into the Indo-European world, and just due to their smaller population size, the Orkney Islands, I think even today, have far, far fewer people than Britain or Ireland. And then they just kind of became indistinguishable every way, and other than that their Y chromosomal haplogroups were different. So the Orkney Islands, they survived the Bronze Age collapse too. They actually retake parts. They'd either controlled or retake a lot of the Scottish Highlands. That could be the origins of what we know as the Picts. This mysterious people that get referenced in some of the Anglo-Saxon texts who may or may not have spoken an Indo-European language. I mean, very, very possible they did not speak an Indo-European language, and they were still speaking that old EEF, or Western hunter-gatherer language that, had been there from thousands and thousands of years, from when they had first settled the British Islands around 4000 to 3800 BC. Other things that were going on, you see there's this attempted Slavic migration, or I should say Balto-Slavic, since the Baltic peoples and the Slavs hadn't split at this point, as they go and they kind of sweep westwards and collide with the Celtic peoples in what's nowadays Germany. The Celts win. There's actually a field, the Talents battlefield, which I think is pretty close to the Elbe River. I'm not that up to date with my German geography. Huge battle, probably like 4,000 guys fought each other in it. One side very clearly, they have lineages typical of Slavic people. The other side has lineages much more typical of, kind of Celtic peoples. So even though they're very similar in the sense they're both largely of Indo-European ancestry with, a lot of that globular amphora EEF and ancestry too, it had been 2,000 years since they'd kind of split from each other. So, we can tell from just the mutations in the Y chromosome that they're pretty different from each other. A bunch of stuff going on in the Mediterranean too. Won't really cover that. The far north, you have something else going on. I mentioned earlier there's the Sima Turbino phenomenon, where you have those extremely skilled metal workers from the Altai Mountains and, kind of Siberia, Mongolia, China, that area. They actually go and they have a major expansion in the Bronze Age collapse as well. They, there's some signs that they've been migrating through Siberia, spreading the Uralic languages. And as a result of kind of this breakdown on all of these trade routes, like the Baltic, for instance, was selling amber all the way down to Egypt. With kind of the general collapse, you have all this chaos. The sea peoples are cutting off the trade routes. There's all these migrations of peoples. They can't export their goods anymore. And undoubtedly, sea piracy is increasing as well. Their kind of like state formations start to disintegrate. We have records from certain periods in the Roman Empire that, like an absurd amount of their state revenues weren't through taxation, but actually through, kind of tariffs on trade. So, the Romans didn't necessarily have the state capacity to go out and collect enough grain, or kind of taxes in kind to build their state, but they did have a very strong control over the seaports of their empire, both in the Mediterranean, the North Sea, and particularly the Red Sea, which was a huge trading port for them, since that's where they did all their trade with India. In India, you find like tons of Roman coins. In Rome, you find all sorts of artifacts, that are clearly from India as well. And they probably imported spices and stuff too. So sea trade, now Rome is an extreme example because it's such a large empire. Undoubtedly, a lot of these prehistoric societies relied heavily on, kind of the sea trade as well. The Greeks most notoriously. The records we have from the Mycenaean period of Greece, immediately preceding the Bronze Age collapse, are actually heavily related to naval conscription. I guess they just couldn't find enough sailors willing to do it voluntarily, but sea was so important to them. I mean, Greece, after all, has tons and tons of islands. They have to sail around to keep in touch with each other, trade goods. Just very, very important in the prehistoric period as well. So the breakdown in those sea trade routes causes collapse in tax revenues. The chiefs their society starts to break down. They can't pay their soldiers. They can't do their gift rituals necessarily, where they would keep the peace by giving each other gifts at certain points in period. So as a result, their society starts to break down, and you have this massive invasion of these Uralic chieftains, the ancestors of the Finns and the Estonians, bearing the N1C haplogroup, who kind of march to the west. They overrun the Indo-Europeans of the Volga. They overrun the Indo-Europeans of like the Oka, and they march all the way kind of to the Baltic. The Baltic peoples, they resist. They build a bunch of forts along the border of what's nowadays like Russia and Belarus. But in the end, it doesn't work, and they still get conquered anyways. In Finland and in Estonia, they go and they end up adopting the Uralic language of their conquerors. And in further south, in Lithuania and in Latvia, the locals there, they keep their Baltic languages for the most part. And I'm just going to put an asterisk on that because there's a lot of disputes over like the Livonian people and how prevalent they were. There definitely were a lot more Uralic peoples in the past that controlled, parts of modern day Latvia. But for reasons in the historical period that I need to read up on, the Latvian language ended up winning over the Livonian. So the Indo-European tongue triumphed in the end. But still, quite a few Latvians and Lithuanians still have that Uralic originating N1C haplogroup. At the same time, too, you have some of those Scandinavian hunter-gatherers we talked about earlier, as well as the Eastern hunter-gatherers who had been kind of living. So the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, they're living in kind of Scandinavia, the far north, prior to the arrival of the ancestors of the Sami people or the Lapp people. And the Eastern hunter-gatherers, who were about half the ancestry of the Indo-Europeans, the other half was the Caucasian hunter-gatherers, and that's just an approximation. They kind of ruled that forest region prior to the Indo-Europeans. The forest region of like northern Russia, I should say, like Moscow, Arhangelsk, Izhevsk, that whole area. So those peoples, like a lot of them got pushed in the far north, like the Eastern hunter-gatherers by the Indo-European conquest. And the Uralics actually intermixed with them quite extensively during their marches west. So even though like the modern Finns, for instance, and Estonians are like 90% of that mix of like the steppe Indo-Europeans and the globular amphora early European farmers, they do have like 10% of their ancestry that's more exotic, coming from the Uralics as well as the Eastern hunter-gatherers. So, and I guess in Finland, there's still a lot of like hydronyms and toponyms, that kind of thing, that come from an unknown language, and there's quite a few words in the Sami languages too that come from unknown languages but appear to share similar structures in a lot of ways. And those are most likely the legacies of the Eastern hunter-gatherers that are kind of still around. It's very possible the Eastern hunter-gatherer languages were distantly related to Indo-European, but it was so far long ago that we can't really tell, especially given the evidence that we have. Meanwhile, further north, the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers lasted until at least 2200 BC, and that kind of collapse in kind of northern Norway. So, and they do have some ancestry of them still survives in the modern-day Sami people, who were like 40% exotic and like 60% of that kind of Indo-European steppe and globular amphora early European farmer mix. So that's got about 15 minutes over time. We get to the Bronze Age collapse and the Iron Age. I'll kind of leave it at that. At some point, I guess I'll have to do the period between the Bronze Age collapse and the Viking era, because there's a lot more I'd like to go over with that. So I will open it up for questions.